When you're in a state of stress or action or alert, then your body is absolutely not healing, regenerating, and restoring. And if you eat late before you go to bed, your brain is not washing itself because it needs to paralyze its body to do that. And if you're digesting, it can't. It's expensive to digest. It's pouring all of its resources into you digesting. So you're never hitting deep restorative sleep. Oxytocin, serotonin, positive endorphins, that's joy.
Welcome to the 1 Million Years of Joy podcast. I'm Dr. Andrea Benaker, your host, and my intention is to inspire you to find more joy in your life through the stories from our guests and the science on joy and purpose. Rebekah, welcome. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I think we're in for a very exciting conversation.
Yes, and since I've met you, I was so enthusiastic to learn more about your work and all the amazing things that you're doing. And so I'm absolutely delighted to engage in this conversation with you today. So before we dive into some of the questions, I just wanted to give our audience a brief introduction. You're an award-winning researcher, a neuroscientist, with over 20 years pioneering experience spanning public and private sectors. And I was wondering if you can start by sharing with us what has been one of the most profound life experiences that has shaped who you are and what you do today.
Oh, that's an easy one. So, I think it started when I was probably 33, looking back on it now. So I was a neuroscientist, researcher with Johns Hopkins. I was, very passionate about all the things I was doing. I was burning the candle at both ends. It was a very long study. I was in a very stressful relationship where I was caring for this person who was not healthy individual. And it just sort of took its toll on my life. And little by little, my body just started breaking down. And within about a 3-year period, I ended up with about 32 different diagnoses. I was on 52 pills a day. I had at least 4 or 5 experimental surgeries. I was forced to have a hysterectomy. And I was in the hospital with my organs shutting down. And it wasn't until I saw a neurologist who was a friend, and he said, tell me your whole life story and start at the beginning, that I realized that I had been internalizing a lifetime of stress and always pretending to be perfect, being amazing for everyone. I'm always the bubbly, happy one. And what I was doing was not allowing myself to actually process the world. And I had become very toxic. And so I was determined to get off of the pills. I was determined to beat the 6 months to live that they gave me. And so went back to school for the postdoctorate in neurobiology, but I was determined to heal my brain and my body. And I knew that the brain was designed to regenerate, but the faster I got away from all of the toxic things in my world, I was shocked at how miraculously the body is designed to regenerate, and we can heal ourselves, but our world is what is very toxic for us and the way we respond to ourselves and each other. So it was life-changing for me. So instead of deciding to be a professor, I had always just researched resiliency and adaptive intelligence. So I was fascinated from the time I was 14. I was taking trips with Doctors Without Borders. I lived 3 years at an orphanage in Guatemala in my early 20s, being a dorm mom. And so I was really fascinated with resiliency. And this sort of was a very personal lived experience of what it takes to be not just resilient in spirit and resilient in life, but also how our brain and body are remarkably resilient if we have the right tools, if we have the right knowledge and understanding. So I decided to sell everything I owned and moved to Europe, where I began working with the UNICEF and the World Bank. My territory was the Western Balkans, and implementing a framework that I had designed with Johns Hopkins and licensed to them, and trained over 3,000 teachers and psychologists and professors, anyone who worked with children. And the idea is actually what are those very specific things that we must create and teach in those very early years to make children remarkably superhuman, adaptive, resilient, high social and emotional skills and intelligence and regulation, and adaptability intelligence or adversity intelligence. And so that was, yeah. And I guess, as Mark Twain says, as way leads on to way, that just unlocked a long path for me. And so now I work a lot with corporations and leaders and individuals. And my love, women who are very high achieving, high stressed, who are really hitting certain areas in their life where they're going through a transformation, or their brain and their body, like mine, said enough. And you need to make a big difference and a transformation for your health. So, yeah.
Your story, and every single time I hear it, I just find it so remarkable. I was wondering if, for the benefit of our audience, you can dive a little bit deeper into the key insights that you have learned from your research on neuroscience and neurobiology that actually helped you heal and live beyond the 6 months that you were originally given at that time.
Well, and it's been 10 years, so that's great. I'm much longer than 6 months. I'm happy to dive into it. I think the most important thing was that when we're in a stressed state, so we're in a state of the sympathetic, right? So you have two kind of nervous system states in the autonomic nervous system, so sympathetic and parasympathetic. And in that stressed state, our body cannot heal itself, our brain and body. It cannot produce DHEA, it cannot produce oxytocin, serotonin, all the things that we talk about for how we feel happiness or even joy, since that's our conversation. It can't do that in a sympathetic state. So, first understanding that I had to be much more in the parasympathetic. We should spend about 80% of our day in the parasympathetic. So, that's in a very calm state, that is feeling happy, that is feeling very relaxed. That's when our brain can be creative and innovative and take perspective of its world and regulate its emotions. So, that state of being doesn't happen if we're stressed. It's just a mathematical equation for the brain and the body. So that was sort of the first thing. And the second thing was I just became radical about detoxifying my life. So if it wasn't healthy and it didn't bring deposits into my body, and I'll talk a little bit about that, how the brain is actually only balancing a body budget. That's sort of what it's doing. But if it wasn't a deposit, if it wasn't a healthy individual, if it wasn't a healthy situation, if it wasn't, a situation where I could be in the parasympathetic, if it wasn't chemical free. So from the food, if I didn't cook it, I didn't eat it. From the air in my home to every piece of furniture being organic and non-toxic, I just went very dramatic to detoxify the body budget. And I had a toxic load. I had become what we call cortisol neurotoxic. So cortisol is that neurotransmitter, that hormone that we produce when we're in the sympathetic state. And if we're in a state of a lifetime of chronic stress, whether we admit it to ourselves or not, then over time we become neurotoxic. And, I think it was the World Health Organization said it about 3 years ago that 90% of all disease is caused by stress. And so I just became a fanatic, I think, about detoxifying my world. And it sort of switched the way I viewed life, because you start to see things in the way the brain actually does process its world. You start to see them in deposits and withdrawals. And you start to make very conscious decisions of what's worth my life. What's worth my one precious life? What's worth my health? And when you put everything in that context, or you're forced to put everything in that context, it shifts your relationship with the world. It shifts your relationship to having this deep, profound respect for your own brain and body and your health, and that nothing is worth your health, nothing. And so it just was this kind of revelation for me of a change in living my life. And it was holistic. And that was also why I decided to not stay and be a professor, not stay and be stressed, and to move and start doing things that made me happy, gave me joy. I had to go back to remembering what was joyful and when was I last joyful. And it was in giving back and changing the world and working with, countries who are struggling to rebuild after war. And that was sort of, the beginning to my own healing, was a remarkable dedication to getting anything stressful and toxic out of my brain, body, and my life.
Very, very beautiful and very inspiring. What self mastery practices would you recommend that individuals pursue in order to reduce their own toxic reality that
Mhm.
they may be experiencing?
Yeah. Oh, that's a very long conversation, but I can try to sum up 20 years into a few minutes. I would say a couple of things. So I probably need to back up and explain something first in order to make this sense. So the brain doesn't function the way we've always thought it before. It's actually not thinking. It doesn't do lots of things that we used to think it does. Its number one priority is called allostasis, but it's body budget. Its number one priority is keeping its beautiful spaceship, as I like to call it, alive and running and healthy. And it makes a prediction. That's the second thing it's always doing, is always predicting for its world in order to make a value judgment about its resources. Is this thing, this potential situation, this person, is this worth expending very precious resources for my brain, for my body? And oftentimes we force ourselves in very toxic work patterns or life patterns to make decisions against our own health. You know, we hear ourselves saying, I just do not have the energy for this today. You should hear yourself saying, your body doesn't have the resources to give for this situation or this person, and you need to go back to bed. You need to go and really dedicate some more time. So I would say the first thing is to understand that the brain is a CFO and a CEO, and it is always focusing on balancing its body budget. It's running a spaceship of intricately designed systems and networks. And we have to understand that we're not just this brain and body floating in space, but that we have a real connection and we're super sensitive to our world. Cellularly, we are remarkably sensitive to our world and to each other. So I would say one of the first things that you can do is radically look at your life. And are you in the parasympathetic 80% of the day? Everyone I ask tell me that they are in the sympathetic. They are in a stressed state, a protection and a conservation state. So even if you don't think you're stressed, if your body is protecting and conserving its resources, your body is stressed. And that understanding is really essential because most people tell me they're 90% of their day. Some people say 100. They're just very honest. 100% of their day is spent in protection and conservation and feeling stressed or in action mode. That's also the sympathetic. So being very aware that you need to keep yourself in the parasympathetic for the majority of the day is actually really important. Focusing on neuro-well-being. So I would say I'm going to talk a lot about sleep and hormones. I know those are huge topics nowadays, and thank goodness, but that's critical. So detoxifying your life is amazing, but if your hormones aren't balanced, and I'm going to talk about it for women, then your neurochemicals aren't balanced. And you can't possibly have a state of the parasympathetic if your brain is feeling depleted from estrogen, if your brain is feeling depleted from serotonin and dopamine. Those things are very important for maintaining our spaceship. I think so. Key critical appointments. I always say, don't worry about vitamins. People love to do vitamins and supplements, and there's all these fads. But to be very honest, it's just expensive urine. I'm sorry to ruin it for a lot of people. And you need to go back to the basic cellular building blocks. So we need to go back to how do we supplement and regenerate our neurotransmitters? How do we supplement and regenerate our amino acids and the cysteine process and the anti-inflammation system in the body? And how do we go back to really stimulating our cellular mitochondria regeneration? So for those things, I would say I became very proactive. I'm also licensed, so I'm a doctor who does hyperbaric oxygen treatment, which is really critical for healing the mitochondria. I'm really a proponent of NAD infusions at least once a month. So NAD is how the body heals and regenerates its healthy cells. I think also IV infusions that can help your amino acids, can help your inflammation load in your body. That's actually a critical piece. So, and I said also nutrition. So the things and the foods that you eat, there's a huge push for fad diets and different types of things. And to be very honest, people are very confused because it's constantly changing, but yet we don't maybe see the results in our life. I would say get clean. If you don't know the word on the label, don't eat it. I would also say that one of the most important pieces is that you should look up, and it's not hard, I'm happy to share it, but an antihistamine, anti inflammation diet. That's what you should focus on because all disease is caused by inflammation. And so that inflamed response in the body is the burden, is the toxic load. And if we can get away from foods and things in our world and our life that trigger a histamine response or an inflammatory response, then we can see remarkable healing and regeneration in the body. I would say that people have lots of different tools for getting and staying in the parasympathetic. I would say do what works for you. I start every morning with writing down I think it's called the 5-minute journal, but sort of starting with hacking into my brain when it is in its predicting process for the day. So instead of allowing my cortisol spike in the morning to trigger anxiety, I will rewire my brain for positivity, for gratitude, for productive outlook on the day. So you can actually rewire the way your brain is processing its day first thing in the morning to different types of things. People practice mindfulness or meditation, people swim, people go out in nature. So I would say whatever works for you that makes you feel joy, makes you feel calm, makes you feel in that parasympathetic, then your body is healing. If you're not feeling that, it's not healing. It's very simple because when you're in the sympathetic, it blocks the parasympathetic, which means when you're in a state of stress or action or alert, then your body is absolutely not healing, regenerating, and restoring. You are degenerating. If you're stressed, you're degenerating. If you're not sleeping well, you're degenerating. And I would say that leads me to sleep, which is another really huge issue for people. We have a lot of gadgets, we have a lot of things, but and we could do a whole episode on sleep, but there are actually really great things you can do to understand that the brain, when it's sleeping, it needs to go through 2 sleep cycles. So if you wake up at like 3 or 4 in the morning, great, you're supposed to roll over and go back to sleep. Don't get up. So the understanding of knowing that your brain needs to wash itself, so it gives itself a bath every night. There's amazing MRI videos online where you can see that when you're sleeping, your brain actually drains all of its cerebral spinal fluid and all of its blood out, and it will through your lymphatic system, which is why it's important to have a healthy lymphatic system, and then it will flush with fresh cerebral spinal fluid, right? So it takes about 7.5 hours to regenerate a full body of cerebral spinal fluid, which is why you need to sleep for that long. And it does it in flashes of about every 20 seconds. So it's like a dishwasher. I know it sounds hilarious, but your brain does a dishwasher cycle every night. And if you're not sleeping well, or if you're waking up in the night and not going back to bed, it's like opening the dishwasher in the middle of the cycle. You will feel that way during the day, that you still have bits and pieces of enzymes and space junk, as I would call it, in your brain that didn't get cleaned away. And that is why we have really high levels of neurodegeneration. So MS and Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, they're increasing because we are increasingly living a stress state where we don't sleep enough and we don't sleep well. Our brain is designed to actually wash itself and heal its body when it's sleeping. And you hear people all the time say, I'll sleep when I'm dead. And I think, no, you're going to die because you don't sleep. But it is an actually critical piece of the puzzle. So something you can do super simple is you don't eat dinner after 7 p.m. You eat soups and purees and eat light, because it's going to take about 4 hours before you go to sleep to go through the digestion. And if you eat late before you go to bed, your brain is not washing itself because it needs to paralyze its body to do that. And if you're digesting, it can't. It's expensive to digest. It's pouring all of its resources into you digesting. So you're never hitting deep restorative sleep. And then you will wake up because your glucose spikes. And then once your glucose spikes, your cortisol spikes. So good luck getting back to sleep because cortisol stays in your bloodstream for up to 3 hours. So I would say some pretty key things: taking 3 tablespoons of olive oil before you go to bed, because that's going to have a really slow release of glucose into the bloodstream, and you won't ever have a dip. So you won't wake up at 3 and 4 in the morning. So very simple things. Like I said, we could spend a lifetime talking about really key ways that we need to change the way we sleep. But I would say those are the most important, which is trying to stay in the parasympathetic 80% of the day. So find things where you set a timer and you go walk outside. You set a timer and you meditate. You set a timer and you do a vasovagal response. So I love, that's my favorite. So a vasovagal response. So your vagus nerve is how your brain talks and controls its body, and vice versa. So it's always communicating. And a vasovagal response is when you faint. And so if your system gets overloaded and your brain is like a computer, it needs to do a hard reset, it'll lay you down. So if you purposefully lay on the ground and you sort of relax with your palms up and you just do long exhales, you can simulate a computer reset of your brain and your body in a way. So I like to do that before and after Zoom calls. I'll be on the floor. Anything happens, chaos, coffee spilled, stuff happens, I'm on the floor because I'm resetting my nervous system. And I can do it that quickly simply by knowing tools and techniques. There's a whole toolkit, and we could spend days talking about them, but I would say find what works for you. Some people it's swimming, some people it's poetry, or it's painting, or crafting. Some people it's being out in nature or co-regulating with animals. Whatever it is that works for you, do it, and do it often.
Rebecca, the suggestions you've made are absolutely fantastic. And I want to potentially go back to some of the key points that you've highlighted.
Sure.
Let's talk about mitochondria, what it is, just for the benefit of our listeners. And can you tell us about the anti-inflammatory diets? What specific foods should our audience avoid, and what should they actually eat more of in order to optimize the cellular health,
Yeah.
basically, within their own bodies?
Super. Those are really important questions. So happy to dive into them. So, your mitochondria is your basic building block of cellular structure. And when our mitochondria replicate, we are cellularly healing, we're cellularly replicating. When disease sets in is when our cells are not replicating correctly, or when they are replicating in a very diseased way. So, when we talk about healing the mitochondria, that is how your body heals and regenerates itself. That's its basic building blocks. When I talked about things like NAD and hyperbaric oxygen therapy, those are ways where you can go back to healing the basic building blocks of the body. And then I do neurotransmitter supplementation. So things like sublingual liposomal GABA. We talk about a lot about glutathione. So very essential amino acids. You need to supplement the brain's resources as well. It needs neurotransmitter support. So those are those basic building blocks. For the diet, I would say the first things to avoid are avoid all nightshades. Nightshades are toxic to humans, to animals. You will know this because children hate them and animals won't touch them because they're a little bit poisonous. We, over time, develop a system where we can tolerate them, but that doesn't mean it's not causing severe inflammation. So, what are nightshades? Tomatoes, white potatoes, not sweet potatoes, those are very healthy. Tomatoes, eggplant, any peppers. So, those type of things you need to avoid. So already I hear people going, oh my God, how am I going to survive? That's a staple in my diet. There are plenty of ways. So there's a company, I think in the US it's called Nomato, and in Europe it's called Histaminicus, where everything they produce is like tomato, barbecue sauce, all of the things, but not made with nightshades. So you can make it with carrots and sweet potatoes and beets, and it tastes the same way. I would say you want to really avoid inulin. So onions and garlic. Again, everybody's going to just faint that I'm saying avoid onions and garlic, but you can get infused, either like olive oil or avocado oil. You can get oil infused with garlic and oil infused with onions and oil infused with all sorts of chili. So you can, and it's much more potent than any sort of pepper you could chop into your food. And it's just an infused olive oil. So if you learn to cook with oils that have very high intense garlic taste or onion or chili, you'll still get all the tastes that you love without the toxic load on the body. Any sort of a wheat. I know so many people are going to faint. I've heard them talk about oats. I'm going to talk about any sort of grains. And the reason is because they are remarkably toxic in the way that we process it and the way that it has mutated over time, and also the toxics and pesticides that we spread on them. Not gluten free. I know a lot of people love gluten free. That can be some of the worst things out there because they fill it with additional additives that the body can't digest. So I would say if you want to focus on ancient grains, focus on amaranth, focus on quinoa, focus on rice. If you're going to have rice, only jasmine rice. So jasmine or Thai rice is the only rice that does not increase like the, I guess glucose is how you could say it, but it's the glycolic load in your body. So it is the one starch, the one rice that your body doesn't process as a sugar. So off the top of my head, I would say those things are key. The other things I would say are really critical is avoid dairy as much as possible. That's really important because it's highly inflammatory. So if you do, you want to look for things that have zero sugar on the back because lactose is a sugar. And so you want to make sure that you're avoiding lactose if at all possible, because your body doesn't break that down very well. And it actually raises your insulin and glucose levels. I think probably the other biggest piece is fruits. So fruits that are super high in sugar, you're going to want to avoid because that's very hard on the brain and body. So when we're spiking the sugar level and then it's diving and then we're spiking and we're diving, that's very dysregulating for the brain and the body. Our days should sort of feel like waves, definitely not like spikes and drops and peaks and drops. So melons, any melon is wonderful, super low in sugars, carbohydrates. Any berries are phenomenal for the brain and the body. And I would say focus on seeds more than nuts. So nuts can also be very toxic because they have a membrane on them. They have a shell that protects them from animals. So almonds, if they have the brown shell on them, they're toxic to the body. So you can have blanched almonds, the white almonds. So we could talk about this, sorry, for a very long time, but that's just those key pieces diet-wise that it takes a little bit of getting used to, but it's not hard. There's whole cookbooks online. I'm actually producing one right now with a whole team of people where we're sharing all of our amazing recipes that you can cook very easily, a histamine-free and an inflammation-free life.
Wow. When is that book coming out?
Give me like a month. Yeah,
Okay.
we're working on it now. So yeah, it'll be digital, which is easier for people. And we're just compiling all the recipes that I've been teaching over the past, I don't know, 15 years, and some of the new ones that the women who have been coming to my neuro well-being reboots, we've all started been cooking together and exploring together. And so we're in the process of putting all of our recipes together.
And talking about recipes, if there would be actually a recipe for joy, what
Oh,
would be the three main ingredients?
I love that because that would probably be the ultimate anti-inflammation recipe, right? I would say I think one of the biggest things is that joy, not to ruin it, it's neurotransmitters. So our whole world we experience through neurotransmitters. So we experience our world through emotion. Emotion and rationality and thinking, they're not separate in the brain. That's ridiculous. In fact, you have an emotion or a sensation to your world up to 3 or 4 seconds before you actually process any cognitive capabilities about this data that you're interpreting. So oxytocin, serotonin, positive endorphins, that's joy. So if you know that that is that recipe, then you want to focus on, and I would say 4 things, not my 3, but a balanced body budget. So really focusing on stasis. If it's not a deposit, then you're in withdrawals and you're in degeneration. So deposits are not histamines, not inflammation, not toxic people, not stress. Focusing on being in the parasympathetic 80% of the day, neuro well-being. So that includes sleep and food. And I would say the biggest one is also co-regulation with healthy, positive people, because we are super sensitive as a species. We actually need each other or we die. So we require each other to regulate our nervous systems. And what we do as a species these days is we are dysregulating each other. So you know this. If anybody around you is stressed, you immediately, whether you realize it or not, they've tripped your body into a stressed state. It's supposed to protect us as a species. So without words, without even noticing it, we can help care for one another, warn each other. But we are remarkably toxic, vomiting our stress co-regulation all over each other. So one of the most important pieces is finding people who you will co-regulate a parasympathetic state with. That's very powerful because we don't realize how much of our day is spent being thrown into the sympathetic by an email, pling, or a phone call, or somebody stomping heavily down the hall, or somebody breathing stressed. We are constantly being triggered into that state of stress. So I would say that's a really important piece, is finding somebody who co-regulates a calm heart rate for you, finding people, spending time with people who co-regulate joy, co-regulate health is necessary.
When we're looking at stress, we have eustress,
Mm-hmm.
or we have the negative stress that we clearly
Mm-hmm.
understand from everything that you have shared has a very, very deeply negative effect on
Mm-hmm.
us at a cellular level.
Yes, there is such a thing as eustress. And that is, if you think about the way the brain processes its world, that everything is a deposit or a withdrawal. Okay. So it can depend on the activity or what's happening, whether or not the brain interprets it as a temporary stress that actually gives it more reward in the end. So it gives more deposits versus the withdrawal. Remember, I said everything is a value judgment for the brain. So let's say working out, you're going to work out, you push your body really hard. It's a lot of withdrawals. It is a lot of withdrawals on the body. But what happens is it rewards itself for being healthy and taking care of itself. And so it will flood with endorphins. You get a dopamine rush, right? It rewards its body much more than the withdrawals it took to do the exercise. Okay. So I would also say if you're in a state of stress, you need to focus on light exercise. So walking, yoga, swimming is amazing, taking off the stress of gravity and the pressure from the body. But intense workouts is not healthy because you don't need to work out to the point to where you stress the body to such an extremity. So I know lots of people talk about flow. Flow is not a state of stress. It's a state of parasympathetic. To be in the zone, to be really hyper focused, to be able to, have innovation and creativity, to focus on really intricately solving things, intense problem solving, decision making, all of these capabilities are in the parasympathetic. So they're in the frontal lobes. That's not a state of stress. It's not. It can't possibly be because in the sympathetic, you don't have access to that. You may feel an immediate sense of urgency. So you will have a flush of cortisol, which gets a bad rap, by the way, cortisol. And you'll have a flush of cortisol because that's what makes you motivated. It makes you, driven to do the task or to do whatever you're doing. But whatever the case is, you've gotten into flow, you've gotten into the parasympathetic because your brain determined that expending a lot of resources on this thing was super beneficial for it in the end. Maybe it's a career advancement or whatever the case may be. It's still, the brain will reward itself with a short-term expenditure for a long-term gain. So like cramming and studying for a test and not sleeping, not healthy, but it is an expenditure because it knows if it passes the class, there's rewards, right? So it's always making value judgments, and that can differ every day based on what your current body budget is. So you can, in one day, have a really great day of eustress and flow, and in the next day, nothing. You will tip your system completely doing the exact same activity. Why? Because your brain decided it didn't have the resources that day to expend it on the sympathetic nervous system, the withdrawals from your day.
And I want to also go back to the hormones that you spoke about earlier. And particularly, I'm thinking about some of our audience listeners that may be experiencing menopause. I mean, the women, of course. What suggestions would you have for some of our listeners that may be in that perimenopause or menopause from a hormonal perspective, and how it connects actually to everything that you have learned from a neuroscience and neurobiology perspective.
I would say, from what we understand now, it's actually very important for the brain and the body. So the brain goes through a very intense, stressful period when it doesn't have the resources it needs. And estrogen is critical for prefrontal cortex and frontal lobe nutrition and capabilities, which is why when we're starting to really get in those first stages of perimenopause or menopause, even after pregnancy, mommy brain is a thing. That what happens is because estrogen regulates those capabilities, estrogen regulates mood. So you're not going to have a state of joy if you're low in estrogen. It's a chemical combination. That's why we feel mood swings. Some people feel depressed, you feel exhausted and low energy, you feel on edge, because you don't have the hormones to balance your body budget. So estrogen is a critical hormone for balancing its body
Really?
budget. Progesterone is necessary for digestion, which is why when we're low in progesterone, we start to gain weight around the middle. We have a hard time losing weight. Foods we used to eat before, now we're highly sensitive to. If we're low in progesterone, then we're not being able to actually digest very well. Estrogen also regulates body temperature and regulates sleep. So that's why when you go through menopause, you have these crazy sleep patterns. You can't go back to sleep. You're waking at 2, 3, 4 in the morning. You're having insane hot flashes or night sweats. It's because your body doesn't have what it needs and your brain doesn't have what it needs. You're depleting your resources. Now, for a long time, there's been this big debate about hormonal supplementation. And I will say that a lot of doctors are not educated in this. There's a huge gap in gender medicine, but there is bioidentical hormones are the ones that I would recommend. And we now recommend that you start 10 years before menopause. So when we're looking at the brain, and there's massive research studies out there, when we're looking at the brain and the body, we can see that it actually begins losing its resources for women around the age of 35. That's Caucasian women, some Indian women, some Asian women. It can be as early as 29. So when I say supplementing with bioidentical hormones, they're not chemical hormones. So everything we've heard up in the past and these fear of hormones that it can cause breast cancer, it can cause heart attacks and strokes, it's simply not true, because those were chemical hormones in those studies. And the body doesn't respond well to chemicals, as we know. Now we have bioidentical. What does that mean? That means that it comes from nature. So, estrogen, if you get a bioidentical estrogen, it's made from soy and cactus. If you get a bioidentical progesterone, it's made from yams. So, and this was something that I think ancient science and ancient wisdom knew. So if we look at ancient civilizations, the women knew to supplement with yams and cactus and soy. They knew how to regulate their brain and their body during menopause. And it's really important. If you think, by the time you start to have symptoms of hot flashes, brain fog, mood swings, your brain and body are starving. It's to the point where it's very hard to come back from that. And so sometimes women, they even on bioidentical hormones, will still continue to struggle through menopause because they waited too late, where their brain and body were starving for key building blocks. Its hormones are its neurotransmitters. That's critical to supplementing life. And so if you don't have hormonal support when they start to wane in those period, then you're in a very stressed state internally.
Very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that. I also want to go back to the point that you touched upon about creating these super kids as a result of your work at UNICEF and the World Bank. What advice would you have for parents in order to raise kids that can experience life with more joy?
Yes. Oh, that's a great question. That's my first love. So I would say one of the things that we're actually currently working for is I had developed a massive curriculum for parents and teachers and licensed that to UNICEF. And it's an online platform, but I'm in the process of recreating it, and I want to put it online for free because the world needs urgent help in this area. So stay tuned for that part of it. But I would say a couple of things is in those key neuroplastic years, so 0 to 7, They are functioning their entire world co-regulating. So you'll notice this with children. They fall down and they won't necessarily cry. They'll look at you to see what your reaction is. So they're always co-regulating with the adults in their world, for good or for bad. And their brain is deciding what to tune and prune. So by that I mean children are born with twice as many neurons as we have as an adult. They're just not finished. We are one of the most adaptable species on the planet. If you think about that, children can be born anywhere in any culture, in any environment, and learn to adapt and thrive, then you understand how really critical those key adaptation periods are. Whatever the brain, the neurons it doesn't need in its world at that time, it will prune so that it can spend more resources building out its bigger, like airport hubs, for a metaphor, right? So the more we can expose them to other cultures, other experiences, the more we can expose them to other languages, the more you can expose them to what we would say a respect for humanity, for giving back to people, volunteering. All of those key pieces were the unlock in the study that I studied. And I studied teenagers who actually were children during Hurricane Katrina. So they were in those early formative years, and we knew that had significantly smaller prefrontal cortexes because of stress, and much more enlarged amygdala and hippocampus centers. So stress responses. But in those second key neuroplastic years, so it's more like 14 to 26, it's much longer than we used to think, was when we could make up some really great ground. And in those, the teenagers who experienced an adult who invested in them, who believed in them, who had that deep one-on-one, trusted, safe co-regulation, who told them that their life mattered, that they had value, those were the children who not only made up gap as teenagers, but they actually surpassed their peers on social, emotional, and adaptability intelligence. I say all that to say, children are also learning language. So they're learning emotional regulation is solid by the age of 7. Yes. The way that we respond to our world habitually. So you would call an instinct or a habit. We call it habitual ways of responding and interpreting our world is pretty solid by the age of 6. So if we understand that those key early years and then the second neuroplastic year, so don't freak out if your kids are not in the window. If the second year you have 14 to 26, you have time. We teach them language for their brain and their body. So all the tools that we wish we had as adults, we need to teach them when they're very young. So teaching them how to activate the parasympathetic nervous system. So all day long, teaching them a toolkit and a strategy for life is critical. So teaching kids how to belly breathe with bears, teaching kids all the words of the brain. I have 3 and 4-year-olds who will tell me that their amygdala feels very stressed so that they need to go sit and vasovagal. They can use the words, they know what's happening, and they know how to regulate their body. Empowering children to regulate their nervous system and to understand what's happening in their brain and body is critical. And then you're exposing them. Once that happens, once they really learn a toolkit for brain body regulation and they learn a vocabulary for brain body and emotional regulation and strategies, and that becomes part of their daily routine, then their brain can become very highly advanced in adversity intelligence and social and emotional intelligence, because you're exposing them to other people in the world. You're exposing them to the joy that comes from co-regulating in a healthy and positive way in their world. And so it instills little dopamine flourishes and it creates new little neuron connections that being a good person in the world actually is rewarding for their brain and body, or giving back to others, or taking care of nature, taking care of the earth, taking care of animals. All of these things reward the brain and body in those early years. So it's very important that we are focusing very critically on understanding that 0 to 7 is who they will become as adults. And we need to teach them their survival skills, the thriving skills of a toolkit for regulation. I would say the biggest one we teach And this is the one I love because it's the body's very natural biological way to regulate yourself. We call it a physiological sigh. You may have heard people say this. It's just a very fancy word for a yawn. So we co regulate so intensively as a species. Yawns are not contagious, we're co regulating. If I yawn, it triggers my parasympathetic nervous system and it reminds your brain that you're going to be in the parasympathetic too. So you will also yawn. We do this naturally. Children even do it. If they've been crying for a while, you'll hear them, they'll go, okay. So when we're talking about a physiological sigh, it's the body's way to trigger a complete parasympathetic response. And so what you're doing is you're going to take a deep in breath, and then you'll, at the very end, it's like a yawn. So you take a deep breath and you at the end go, just do it just a little bit deeper. So you're really opening the lungs and oxygenating the bloodstream. And then it's like a bear sigh, because the in breath is the sympathetic and the out breath is the parasympathetic. We live in a constant state of balance. Sympathetic, everything's activated and awake. Parasympathetic, everything's calm and healing and resting and digesting. So if the out breath is twice as long as the in breath, then you can trigger a parasympathetic response. So simply walking around yawning on people sort of gives you like a protective bubble so that people are co-regulating in the parasympathetic with you. I think we should start a movement yawning all the time.
Indeed. I love that. And if there would be one fun challenge for
Mm.
our audience to bring more joy into their daily lives, what would you recommend?
Oh, this is a hard one. Um, hmm. So I would say probably after everything I've talked about, to be very honest, it's body budget regulation. So go out and find things that stimulate the parasympathetic. So we use the word joy, but the feeling of joy or the feel it's not a feeling. It's actually called affect. It's mood. So the ability to have a balanced mood depends on neurotransmitters and depends on hormones. The ability to feel content and satisfied with life. That's the mood of joy. So if that's the case, go out and find at least one new thing that makes you feel in the parasympathetic. Maybe it's swimming, maybe it's running, maybe it's playing out in nature. Remind yourself of what you did when you were young that gave you great joy and start doing it more. I have a trampoline, and between calls, I jump on the trampoline in my house because it stimulates the feeling of joy in my body and my nervous system. It is the parasympathetic. So something as small as that, or having a yoga ball that you bounce on when you're working on the computer, that's stimulating joy. That's stimulating the parasympathetic.
I love that. Any final words of wisdom, Rebecca, that you would like to share with our audience? And if they want to learn more about your work, what would be the best way?
Yes, absolutely. So we just recently started a platform. It's neuroevolve.org. And on there, you can easily reach out to me. But we are in the process of, like I said, publishing open source. So we want everything to be open source for people. I think the world is a bit on fire. So getting a recipe and a cookbook and an online platform where women can share and get excited about recipes for antihistamine and anti-inflammation, finding ways and practices. So I'm going to publish what I wrote for UNICEF and the World Bank. So you can start doing the videos and doing the work with your children. So I think just taking the small step of transforming your life is critical. You don't have to do it overnight. I was dying, so it was remarkably urgent and critical for me, but it saved my life. Not to be on all the chemical medication, not to keep having all the surgeries, but to understand that we have a very delicate spaceship. And if we tip our brain and body and we tip ourselves into a state of toxicity, then that is the critical piece for us living long and healthy, but also feeling joy. That mood of feeling healthy is what we're putting the word joy to.
Wonderful. Rebecca, it's been an immense pleasure to speak with you today. Thank you for all the wisdom you have shared. I'm sure it will be invaluable for our audience. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much for having me. It was great.